Hello everyone, welcome to our session in Ethology Learning or Learning Behavior. In the last session, we have discussed the two important types of learning. There were the habituation and sensitization. And now we are moving on to the third set of learning or type of learning or the third type of learning, and that is associative learning. So, in this type of learning, what we are going to say is that while an organism learns something, it is going to associate its learning to something. So, it will be associating a particular response or a particular stimulus to something, and it will be responding to that. For say, as I mentioned in the earlier sessions, that while we learn something, and if it is tough or hard, so what happens is if you do or if you associate it with some familiar terms, which we are familiar with, and in such cases, that difficult term becomes easy, or that makes us remember that particular term very easily. So that is what is called as associative learning. So not only in the case with academic learning, in our day-to-day lives, all organisms they do or they have this particular type of learning, which is called as associative learning, where they associate the stimulus with something and they respond to that. And in associative learning, the famous or the important type of we have two important type of associative learning to be discussed. One is classical conditioning, and the second one is operant conditioning. So the first one is the classical conditioning, which you might have heard earlier, which is the Pavlov's experiment with the dog. So in this particular classical conditioning, we are going to see the details of that particular experiment, which is called as the Pavlov experiment. So in this classical conditioning or classical conditioning, this particular type of learning, which was put forward by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. He was not a psychologist. He was not into something which is called as ethology or learning behavior. He was a physiologist, and what he was in the Russian, he was a doctor in the Russian military, and he was supposed to be learning the mechanism of digestion. So he was devising the mechanism of digestion. He was learning that, and when he was learning the mechanism of digestion, he came across this particular type of behavior, which was shown by one of his experimental dog, and that came to something which is called as, or later came to this particular type of learning, which is very important in ethology or animal behavior, which is called as classical conditioning or Pavlov conditioning. So he was actually, as I said, he was actually into learning of the mechanism of digestion, which got him the Nobel Prize in 1904. So what Pavlov was studying was that he was studying the mechanism of digestion. So I have read in some books where the very rude experiment which was performed in animals and also in humans during that particular time. So one of this experiment in digestion of related to protein digestion, which I have read somewhere, is that now what he was doing is when a soldier, as I said earlier, he was in the military, he was a military doctor, and when a soldier was wounded in the stomach, when a bullet was fired in his stomach, a pretty much bigger hole was formed, and when the bullet was removed, the hole which was created by the bullet was, or the damage which was created by the bullet, led to a hole that led to the stomach. And what or the Pavlov's experiment, what he did was that to study the digestion of meat, whether it is happening in the intestine of the stomach. What he did was that he stuffed that wound with meat, and he took the meat outside and meat after some time, and he was observing whether it was at what time it was getting digested. So such bizarre experiments were conducted because there were no much sophisticated instruments to study things. So such bizarre experiments led the way to our current understanding of what physiology is. So as I mentioned earlier, when he was studying the mechanism of digestion, in one of his experiment with the digestion, which happens in the buccal cavity, he was experimenting with a dog, and that is what you see here. So this is an experimental setup which he said. So this is also considered to be the experimental setup of our classical conditioning. So actually, what he was trying to understand, and this is what this was that how or what is this particular saliva, or how much amount of saliva is being produced during a particular the hunger prawns, or when you have hunger, or when you see a food, what is the amount of saliva is being collected or formed in the buccal cavity, because that is part of the digestion, which is called as buccal digestion. And he was studying that. So what he did was that for this, so you can see that this is the experimental setup where the dog is fastened with many bells to this to these particular pillars, and you can see it is tied up at different points so that it does not move from this particular setup. And you can see that a particular cannula is inserted, a operation is being done in its lower part of the jaw, and this will be inserted into the buccal cavity, so that the saliva which is being formed in the buccal cavity will drain through this tube, and it will be connected at the particular beak which is present here. And the amount or the stimulation that is happening in this, or the amount of saliva which is being poured here, will be recorded in this drum. The amount will be recorded at different points in this particular drum, which which will be recorded here. So this was the experimental setup for studying the mechanism of digestion. What he did, but the same setup led to the or paved the way to the particular to illustrate the particular type of learning, which is called as classical conditioning. So in classical conditioning, what happens is that here, uh, when the dog was here, what the actual experiment of digestion was that the dog will be presented with meat powder, and when meat powder is presented, because when we see our or when we are starved and when we see food, what happens is naturally, so it's a natural response that happens in our body without our control. It's an involuntary reaction which nobody can control. When you are in hunger and when you see food, what happens is our salivary glands starts to secrete saliva, expecting that the food will now come to the mouth. So that is an involuntary reaction which cannot be controlled by us. What can be done is you can just swallow the saliva what comes up, but you cannot control the secretion of saliva when you see favorite food when you are hunger, or the smell of a particular food, etc. So that was what he was studying. So at times he would put this meat powder and might be recording the saliva which was coming out. But being a military camp, or it was a military camp where he was conducting this experiment, the dog was also provided food along with the soldiers. So there was a regular timing when all the soldiers were given the food, so that a bell will be rung, so that all the soldiers will gather in their lunchroom or dinner room, or there, and they'll be having their food. So at that particular time, all the animals which are in the camp also will be provided with the food. So every time, so this dog was also given the particular food during that particular after ringing the bell. So after many trials, so many trials means this was happening as a regular event in the military camp, and Pavlov could notice that the ring of the bell, because at sometimes the food might be coming a little late to the dog, but soon after the bell is rung, Pavlov found that saliva was collected in this particular tray before the food was presented to the dog. After Soon after the bell, Pavlov found that the dog was salivating and the saliva was collected in this particular tray. And this paved the way to this particular experiment or particular type of learning, which is called as classical conditioning. So this is also, or as we said in the beginning, this is a type of associative learning where an animal associate a stimulus with another stimulus and gives the same response. So here, in classical conditioning, we'll come across some terms and we'll explain classical conditioning according to that particular terminology. So in classical conditioning, so with this, we'll draw a brief picture of what classical conditioning is. So here, what happened to the dog was that, as we discussed, the dog started salivating without seeing the food. So what happened, or what actually happened in dog's brain was that what it learned was that. So in the previous weeks or after the start of the experiment, the dog was provided by the meat powder. The bell was rung. Soon after that, the meat powder or the food was presented to the dog, and the dog will have that food. So that was now an ongoing process in that particular military camp. So what the dog learned from that. So I just point out the fact that this particular classical conditioning, this does not happen in one trial. That means one day I ring a bell and after that I give food for the dog. Don't expect that next time, when you do the same thing or when you ring the bell, the dog should salivate or it should show the response. So that does not happen. So it is a process of learning. So it is a trial and error process. Trial and error means it takes many trial, not error. Many trials should be there. That means the dog is learning this particular thing slowly. That means for 1 week or two, without Pavlov being knowing, the dog was learning that, or dog was recognizing that soon after the bell is rung, he will be getting the food. So he's associating that. He's associating his food with the bell. So soon after the bell is rung, he's expecting the food will come and he starts salivating. So this is what is where the association happens. Association means the food is the stimulus for the dog to salivate. So that is a normal response in every animal. When it sees the food, it will salivate. So there is a stimulus, which is a food, and the response is salivation. Okay, so you have a stimulus and you have a response. As we said in the beginning, in learning you have a stimulus and a response, and that is the path where learning occurs. So you have a stimulus here, which is food, and the response is salivation. The dog starts salivation upon seeing or upon seeing the food. So that's a normal response to an organism. So gradually what the dog did was that the dog started associating the food, which was the stimulus, to another stimulus, which is bell. Okay, so here now we'll term this particular stimulus and response in some the terms which is respected or denoted in classical conditioning. So you have so these are the stimuluses and responses, and we are going to name it according to the classical conditioning terminologies. So you have the food, as I said, this is the first stimulus, and salivation is the response to that particular stimulus. So here, food is an unconditioned stimulus, because unconditioned in the sense that nobody has taught us. When you see food, you salivate. So that is an unconditioned reflex. That's why I use the term involuntary. Every organism, upon seeing their food or seeing the food when they are hungry, naturally salivation occurs without his or her or without the animal's control. So that's why this particular stimulus, food, is called as an unconditioned stimulus. Nobody has conditioned you when you see a food, you salivate. So that is normally happening, or that is a natural process. So here, food is an unconditioned stimulus, and its response, salivation in response to food, is called as the unconditioned response. That also is not conditioned. That also occurs naturally. And what the dog has associated. So that is what is called as conditioning. The dog is associating the food with the bell. Okay, now food is replaced, or the stimulus food is being replaced by bell. so that it salivates on the ringing of bell. So here the food plus the bell. So this is the situation. The first is the situation. What is happening before conditioning? The dog is not getting conditioned. This is for normal dogs, where when they see the food they salivate, and when it is under the conditioning process, that means it is learning. It is not conditioned. It is in the process of learning, or it is in the process of associating. That is the second step. So in the second step, the dog is starting to associate the food plus bell. So food is an unconditioned stimulus and the bell is a conditioned stimulus that is being provided from outside, and it does not have anything with related to food. So that is what is called as conditioned stimulus, and and that will result in salivation. So both the events occur at the same time. So the bell is ringing. So in the first step, there is no ringing of the bell. This is a response which is seen before conditioning. The dog is not hearing the bell, etc. A normal dog, which is not in the experimental condition, which is not in a military camp, etc. When it sees the food, it will salivate. So that is a normal response. The second one is the situation where the dog is learning when it hears the bell, when it is giving the food, or when it is given the food plus bell. So it is at the process of conditioning. It has not been conditioned yet. When you say a dog or a particular stimulus is conditioned, what happens is the normal stimulus will be replaced by the conditioned stimulus. That means without seeing the food, it will start salivating. So it is being replaced. That means our brain is recorded, or the we have what we have learned earlier is that when you see a food, which is, as I said, it is an involuntary response. When you see a food, so the sight of the food, you start salivating. So what happens is during the conditioning process, this particular food, the visual scene of the food, is replaced by the sound of the bell. So what happens to the dog after conditioning is that without the visual stimulus, the food, hearing the sound of the bell, the dog is starting to salivate. So that is the middle process is nothing but the process where the process of conditioning is occurring. That is the food and the bell is being provided at the same time. Salivation occurs during conditioning process. Salivation will be due to the food because food is being presented. So after many times, what you see is that if you delay the process of if you delay the food, or if you delay the food to the dog, what happens is on hearing the bell itself without seeing the food. That's why I said the visual stimulus is replaced by an auditory stimulus in this case. The visual stimulus was the first one, which was involuntary. On seeing the food, a hungry animal, it starts to salivate. So after conditioning, what happens is that on hearing the bell, without seeing the food, it will show the response of seeing the food, which is salivation. So here the bell is the conditioned stimulus, and here salivation is an unconditioned response, and unconditioned response to a conditioned stimulus is also called as a conditioned response. So when you hear the bell, or when the dog hears the bell, it is salivating. Okay, and that salivation is not because of the first one, which was an which is due to the visual or the sight of the food, and this was due to the ringing of the bell, and such a response without an unconditioned stimulus, which is food, and that is due to a conditioned stimulus, is also called as a conditioned response, or CR. So here we come to or came across four terminologies: unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, which is a response, a normal response to a food. And after conditioning, what happens is the unconditioned stimulus, which was food, is replaced by bell, and bell is what is called as conditioned stimulus. It is called as a stimulus because on hearing the bell, a dog which is conditioned, on hearing the bell without seeing the food, it is giving the response of salivation. So that we call it as a stimulus, and that is called as a conditioned stimulus, and the other one is called as a conditioned response or an unconditioned response. So it gives an unconditioned response. So the concepts coming under classical conditioning are we discussed earlier. One is unconditioned stimulus, which is US, a stimulus which is producing a response without prior learning. But I mentioned as an involuntary stimulus, the sight of the food, an unconditioned response that is unlearned. Nobody made us learn to salivate at the sight of food. No animal is being taught to salivate at the sight of the food. That is a natural process that is happening in the body, a natural physiological process which is happening. And that response to the unconditioned stimulus is automatically elicited by the salivation in Pavlov's experiment. And the other two terminologies are conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. This is a neutral stimulus that eventually elicits conditioned response. So, bell in the first case, or bell when you consider it as a stimulus, that is neutral. Neutral in the sense it does not have anything to stimulate the dog for salivation, it's just a sound. But after conditioning, what happens is that means if you do or if you are trying to condition a dog for the first time, okay, I give the food, I'm bringing the bell. That bell in the first trial of the experiment is a neutral response or a neutral stimulus, in the sense that the neutral stimulus, in the sense this particular uh, uh, stimulus does not have any reaction on the dog. That's why this is called as a neutral stimulus. And the other one, the second one, is called as the conditioned response, as we discussed. It is the learned response to the conditioned stimulus. So these are the terms, four terms, what we came across in what is called as in our learning of classical conditioning. So these are the four terminologies that we discussed in classical conditioning, which was US and UR, CS and CR. Coming to classical conditioning, what actually happens in classical conditioning is that a neutral stimulus is getting associated with a meaningful stimulus and acquire the capacity to elicit the response. Okay, so that's we discussed. So a neutral stimulus, which is a bell, is associating with a meaningful stimulus. A meaningful stimulus was food. The sight of the food was a meaningful stimulus, meaningful in the sense that would elicit a response in the dog. But what happens after conditioning is that the neutral stimulus is replacing it. The visual sight of the food is being replaced by the sound of the bell, which was neutral, that does not have any physiological response in the dog, but it has got conditioned to it. So it is getting associated or replaced with a meaningful stimulus, and that mean or neutral stimulus is having the capacity to elicit similar response. That is, what is the response the dog shows during the meaningful stimulus, which is the uh, salivation, is also shown when the meaningful stimulus is replaced by neutral stimulus. And that's why it is called, or this is a form of an associative learning. And this is a substitution and association of one of the stimulus with the other. So this is also called as a substitution response, where one stimulus is substituted with another stimulus. Okay, so here substitution occurs with a stimulus, a meaningful stimulus is getting substituted with a neutral stimulus in classical conditioning. So this is what we explained earlier. Under normal circumstances, what happens is the unconditioned stimulus, which is the bell, does not have a response. That's why I said when you're first ringing the bell in front of the dog, it does not respond to it. It does not even hear what is happening. As we discussed, it happens after many trials. After the dog is hearing this for many times, it is getting associated. So in the first trial, under normal circumstances, a bell does not have any response to the dog. Unconditioned stimulus, that means a food, it produces the unconditioned response, that is salivation. And during conditioning, when pairing occurs, so during conditioning, the pairing of the US and CS occurs, which is the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus becomes paired, and that will result in the unconditioned response. After pairing, after conditioning, what happens is, so pairing and substitution occurs. So during conditioning, pairing occurs, and after conditioning, one of the pair substitutes the other. That is, a meaningful stimulus is being substituted by a neutral stimulus after conditioning, and you have a conditioned response there, which is well, and a conditioned stimulus, which is well, which result in a conditioned response, which is salivation. And the prerequisites of classical conditioning, which is the requisites which we discussed in learning. One is contiguity, which is a degree of association. Degree in the sense when during conditioning, as I said, there is a pairing of US and CS. And the US and CS, the pairing or for an active or an a meaningful pairing to occur. That is when CS and US is pairing, and when they should pair correctly, and that should really lead in conditioning. When they pair, the prerequisite is contiguity or nearness, as we discussed earlier. That means the time interval between the US and CS should be very short. If it is long, conditioning usually does not occur as or conditioning usually does not occur if US and CSS is not near. Usually conditioning is seen when the US and the CS nearness is fraction of a seconds. That means the bell is ringing at the same time the food is being provided. So, and in such condition or such contiguity where both the CS and US is of a very or is distanted or presented with a very short time period, you can see that conditioning occurs at a very faster rate. So the third one is contingency, that is predictability of the occurrence of one stimulus from the presence of the other. So that's also required. Otherwise, associative learning does not happen. That means after or during conditioning, what the dog expects is that is what is called as predictability. The dog is expecting that on the sound of the bell, in the next moment he will be getting the food. Okay, that means when the what we said, the contiguity is happening. Contiguity means the nearness. So the dog has learned the nearness of both the stimulus, that is the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus, and there should be contiguity in the sense that the dog is supposing that on the sound of the bell, it is expecting that the food will come next. That's why it starts salivating. So the same thing happens with the example of lighting. Or when you see a very big flash of lightning, what you expect is that at the next fraction of the second, a very big thunder will come. And what we usually do is we put our hands on the ears. So that is we are expecting. That is what is called as contingency. That means when you see lightning or a very big flash of lightning, we expect that in the next moment a very big sound of thunder will be coming. Okay, that is what is called as contingency. The same thing happens in classical conditioning where the dog is expecting at the sound of the bell, at the next moment he expects food. That's why he starts to salivate during the process of conditioning or classical conditioning. So the other prerequisite is reflexes, which is the automatic stimulus response connection. So there should be a stimulus response connection where when you see the food, the response should be there. So there should be a reflex mechanism. Only if there is this reflexes mechanism, there will be something which is called as an associative learning or conditioning. So the Pavlov's theory is also considered to be as a stimulus substitution. As I said, a neutral stimulus gets or a meaningful stimulus is getting substituted with a neutral stimulus. So it is the nervous system is being structured in such a way that the CS and US bonds together, and eventually the CS is substituting or substitutes for the US. Okay, so that's what is called as classical conditioning. And this is another experiment which proves that if two stimuli or if two conditioned stimuluses are provided at the same time, well, the animal gets conditioned to both the stimulus. Okay, we have an unconditioned stimulus, and in the Pavlov's experiment, the conditioned stimulus was only the bell. So what in the next experiment we are going to see that if there is two conditioned stimuluses, Okay, whether the animal gets conditioned to both the stimuluses or with one. So that's what we are going to see. So this is Leo Kamin's experiment, which was a continuation of classical conditioning to prove whether two stimuluses at the same time produce the same response. So a rat was conditioned by repeatedly pairing a tone, which was a conditioned stimulus, a sound, and a shock, which was unconditioned response, until the tone alone produced a fear. So, what in a cage, a rat was presented in a cage, and the floor of the cage was provided with the electric circuits. And what they did was that they will on the electric circuit plus a tone was given, so that after many trials, the rat got conditioned where the shock got replaced with the tone. That means actually it is the shock that causes the fear. Okay, fear in the rat. So that is a normal response. When you get a shock, we also respond in such a manner. We get a fear where the place where we get the shock, we just move away from there. So, or we take the hand from there, or whatever the situation might be. So that's it. That's also happening for the rat. When shock is provided, the response, the fear is shown by the rat. But after conditioning with the tone, the rat began to show the fear in the absence of shock. So that was the normal conditioning, like Pavlov. So now what they did in the next experiment was the tone continued to be paired with the shock, but the light was turned on each time the tone was sounded. Okay, so what they did was that they conditioned the rat with the first stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, which was the tone. So what they did is when the tone was being provided for the rat showed the fear. So upon the tone, they also provided a light. Okay, so the second step of conditioning, that is, the first conditioning was perfect, where whenever the tone was sounded, the rat showed fear without shock. And upon the tone, they also provided light, so that to know whether now this tone will be replaced by light. So what they found was that such a replacement usually does not occur. Even though light and chalk were repeatedly paired, the rat showed no conditioning to light. So that was the experiment. That is, you cannot pair this with two such conditioned stimulus. The explanation for this is simple, because after many trials, so you are trying this for many times. You put the tone the first time after conditioning with the tone, the rat will show the fear. You do it for 15 times. So the rat will learn that the tone is not giving him shock. Okay, so it does not associate the tone with the shock and also with the light. Okay, so it learns that repeating this particular tone without the shock, it will learn that the shock does not have any effect on it. As a result, the conditioning will slowly decrease. Okay, so the next is the generalization and discrimination. So the tendency of a similar response to elicit the response is called as generalization. So in classical conditioning also, generalization can happen. That means similar stimuluses can also elicit the same response. The bell, in the sense, so different tones of the bell, for say, during a particular time can also elicit the same response, and the process of learning to respond to a certain stimulus and not responding to the other. So that's also the same here. That is what was shown in the case with Kamin's experiment. It started to discriminate. That is, after many trials, it started to discriminate that the tone alone is not causing anything to it. So discrimination of the stimulus can also occur in classical conditioning. Extinction. So this is what is proved by Kamin's experiment. Beginning of the conditioned response in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. The same thing can happen with the dog. So you have conditioned the dog upon hearing the bell, it will start to salivate after conditioning. If you do this with the dog for 50 times, you are ringing the bell, it is salivating. You are doing this for 20 or 50 times. What the dog understands is the bell is not giving him the food, or the ringing of the bell does not lead to food and satiation of his hunger. So that slowly it becomes weaker and it starts and it does not respond to it. That means without in the absence of in the absence of food, in the case of Pavlov's experiment, this particular stimulus it starts to weaken and that will result in extinction. And next is a spontaneous recovery. So a conditioned response recurs after a time delay without further conditioning. Okay, so that what is spontaneous recovery in the sense that, as we said, there is a weakening of response, or without if you are not providing food and if you are continuing the trials with the unconditioned stimulus, the response or the response will decrease. And if you are trying to condition it again, okay, that means if you are again providing food, ringing the bell. So gradually the dog will be getting associated with it again. So in this particular case, or in this when you are trying to condition it for the second time, that means you condition the dog for the first time, and it after many experiments it resulted in extinction. And again, you are trying to associate the dog with the same thing, the sound of the bell and the food. It will associate much faster than the first time. That means in the first set of or during the first set of conditioning, if it took 50 trials for getting conditioned, during spontaneous recovery, that means when you are conditioning it for the second time, what you can see is that it will be conditioning with fewer trials. If it was 20 in the first case or 50 in the first case, it will be getting conditioned with 10 trials in spontaneous recovery. So that is what is called as spontaneous recovery in this experiment. Classical conditioning can be also divided into two types: classical reward conditioning and classical aversive. So we take the two examples of the rat as well as the dog. The first is Pavlov's experiment with the dog, which is reward conditioning, where the dog is expecting a reward with the stimulus, with the conditioned stimulus. The dog is expecting a reward. That means it is expecting food at the sound of the bell. That is called as reward conditioning. Classical aversive conditioning is when the CS is paired with an aversive stimulus. That's what we saw in Kamin's experiment, where the rat was given a shock which elicited fear. So that was an aversive stimulus where we are conditioning it with an aversive stimulus. So these are the two types here. So next is the Thorndike experiment, which we will discuss in the next session. And this is about the second type of associative learning, which is called as the operand conditioning. So we'll discuss Thorndike experiment, which is followed by the operand conditioning in the next session. So thanks for hearing.